What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be doing something a little bit different. So I know how much you all love listener encounters, and I also have seen how much you guys really love when I cover true crime, like disappearances, mysterious disappearances, and things like that. I did not have enough time to script 2 videos this week, so I have cases of mass disappearances, and then I'm like, what am I going to do for the other video? I decided to go through my books, Campfire Stories Volumes 1 and 2, because those are encounters that were sent in from the public, and that some of them I got off the internet, but most were sent in to me by you guys, by so many different people from so many different walks of life, of experiences and encounters they've had with terrifying things in the woods. And I knew you guys would really enjoy that. Also, my new books, Mysterious Disappearances Volumes 1 and 2, I know you guys really like the mysterious disappearances. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a few stories from each of those 4 books, read them to y'all, leave the links of where you can get them on Amazon, Kindle, paperback, Audible in the description box, and hopefully not only give you guys a very enjoyable video, but boost my book sales a little bit. Why not? 2 birds, 1 stone. Without further ado, let's just jump right in. We're going to start with Campfire Stories Volume 1. The first encounter we have today is called Injured ETs, and it goes like this, quote, "I'd been hiking those woods bordering my grandfather's ranch since I was old enough to keep up with my dad's long-legged stride. We created adventures between the ponderosas and pinyon pines, built secret forts from deadfall juniper branches, and just had an overall great time. The land felt like it was part of me, and I know my dad felt the same, having grown up having his own adventures with his siblings and my grandfather. When my dad passed away, I was devastated, but I found solace in wandering around all of those childhood trails by myself and thinking about all of the great times we had out there when he was alive. The experience I had out there that I am choosing to write about today was one I will certainly never forget, and I often wonder what my father would have done had he been there. I hadn't ever had anything strange happen to me out there, whether alone or with my dad, and I never expected to experience anything otherworldly because I didn't believe in extraterrestrials or paranormal forces at that time. It just wasn't how I was raised. We hadn't ever discussed those things when I was young, and as you can probably imagine, we really didn't have any reason to. These woods were the last place on earth I ever expected to experience the type of fear I felt that day while it was all happening, and even now, looking back on it, I wonder if maybe I had lost my damn mind. Most of the time, though, I know exactly what I saw and that it was real, but I try not to talk about it with people because it's one of those things where you had to have been there to be able to understand it, let alone believe in all of it. That afternoon, I went out in search of an old lightning-split cottonwood along the creek. It was deeper and further off into the woods than I normally liked to go, and so I hadn't been there in a really long time. Light filtering through the trees dappled the trail, and even with how much deeper I had gone, it led me even further into that wilderness. I didn't think anything of it, except that I hadn't remembered the tree being that far away from the trailhead before. I shrugged to myself and kept on going, but once I was near the stream, I was able to hear it for a split second before everything went totally silent all at once. I literally heard it happen. One moment there was the sound of the creek babbling and running through the forest and all of the other usual afternoon sounds surrounding me everywhere, and then suddenly I couldn't hear anything at all. The breeze stilled, no chickadee cheerful calls, no squirrel spiraling a furrowed trunk. I was instantly uneasy, and I paused for a minute to try and hear something, anything, to let me know that everything was still okay. I heard nothing, and it was like the woods were holding their breath at the sight of me, or possibly because of something else that I hadn't yet discovered. This was the first time dread had ever overtaken me in those woods, and it prickled at the back of my neck in the very unnatural silence. Where are the birds and all of the other usual rustlings gone? My once familiar sanctuary instantly felt darker and more scary than it ever had before, but I couldn't put my finger on what was making me feel that way aside from the silence. Suddenly, as I looked around tensely, a grouse burst from some concealing shrubs nearby, cackling loudly as it did so. I laughed in relief, as sound and the illusion of normalcy was back around me, because I at least heard the grouse, so it made the rest of the silence seem a lot less threatening. Any lingering wariness began to fade as I wandered around the area a little more, thinking about life and trying to push the nervousness out of my mind and just relax. Eventually, I went home without any further instances of odd silence or any other strangeness, but I had a nightmare that night that brought it all back up to the forefront of my mind. In the dream, I was staring out of my bedroom window, which faced out into the forest, and I was looking towards the area where I had the strange experience. Beyond the window, the darkness outside seemed close, like it was bulging against the glass pane and trying to get inside of my room. Trees, silhouettes, twisted, sinister shapes against the yard light. There was something out there that I couldn't see, but it was watching me and observing everything all at once. I jumped up in my bed, startled, and immediately got up and went to the window. It was the exact same as it had been in the nightmare, and I knew I was being observed at that moment. I looked around, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the tree line because there were no lights that far out in the yard. I thought I saw something moving around for a minute, but when I looked harder, I still couldn't see anything. I went and laid back down, eventually succumbing to sleep again very quickly. I had the same nightmare, but don't remember anything past looking out the window and knowing something was out there watching me as I slept and as I looked out and searched for it in the darkness. I opened my eyes again and the sun had fully risen. I greeted the morning sun, relieved that I wouldn't have to deal with that creepy feeling of being watched again, or so I thought, at least until the nighttime came again and I was stuck in my bedroom alone. As I ate my breakfast and looked out onto the deck and into the woods, I decided I needed a distraction. Staying in the house I grew up in with my mom gone and my father no longer alive was just too much for me right then, and so I decided to go into the woods. I was merely delaying the inevitable task of why I had been there in the first place, and that was to pack up all of my father's belongings so that my mother, who had divorced him a decade earlier, could sell the place. She wanted me to say goodbye to my childhood home and my dad and take whatever I wanted of his before she sold it all. I figured I would go out and take some photos of the sunrise out there among the trees and keep them in a scrapbook with other photos Dad and I had taken throughout my life. I finished my food and set off on another adventure, instantly relieved to find that the woods had taken on none of the previous night's strangeness or the feeling of the watchful eyes on me. At least, not at first. The colorful spray of fading leaves drew me onward once the massive tree came into sight between some guardian oaks. I gripped the lower limbs, relishing the stretch and pull of muscle as I climbed up into the red and gold branches, as I had done with many of the trees in those woods throughout my life. I glanced up, and as I looked all around me at the wilderness surrounding that tree, my breath immediately caught in my throat. About 12 feet or so away from where I was in that tree, there was a strange figure lying at the bottom of one of the other trees, sprawled out and unmoving as I watched in horror. I had no clue what I was looking at, but even from that distance, I could tell it wasn't any sort of animal that I was familiar with. I looked up once more and saw another of the same type of figure sprawled up in that same tree where the first one laid at the bottom, and saw that it was also unmoving and bizarre looking, stuck inside of the massive boughs of the tree. With my heart nearly jumping out of my chest, I wondered what those creatures were and how anyone could have climbed so astonishingly high without any equipment. Peering closer, details filtered through the fluttering foliage. I climbed up as high as I could go and then looked through my binoculars. I saw what looked like a tattered military-style jumpsuit and the gaunt limbs bent at strange angles inside of it. Broad, bare feet that almost looked webbed, none of it computed. Then my gaze locked onto the smooth, hairless face tilting towards sunlight. Lips that seemed gray? No, they were more greenish, and it had enormous almond-shaped eyes that were solid black, taking up over half of its narrow face. Those impossibly large eyes were now gazing directly at me as I clung paralyzed to the creaking limbs all around me. It had long, spidery fingers, and its skin reminded me somewhat of that of a lizard or some other similar reptile, yellowish-green and rough. The creature's penetrating gaze seemed to stare straight through me and penetrate my bones. I was too terrified to even scream, and I was becoming more confused by the moment. There was no menace to the creature, at least not anymore, and its tiny slit of a mouth hung slightly open, enough for me to clearly see it had a mouth of yellowing, razor-sharp teeth that seemed too tiny to be human, but perfectly sized for the mouth of a reptile. I didn't dare move, thinking that if there were two of them that were dead, then surely there were more, somewhere. I found nothing at all earthly about the creature, and still I couldn't move for fear of alerting them to my presence, and scared they would jump up as if they had just been waiting for me to make a move to get away, before they then made theirs to come after me. I immediately thought of the night before, of the nightmare of peering out the window and then actually doing so, and knowing something sinister was out there in the woods where I just then stood. These creatures were unlike anything I had ever seen before and were fundamentally alien, but I didn't know how to come to terms with that just then and didn't really have any time to process it as something horrible happened. The creature that was in the tree's eyes blinked twice, very slowly, and I saw a resigned sadness shadow its narrow face. The lithe, two long limbs moved, enfolding the slender torso defensively. Then its eyes were closed, and it wasn't moving anymore. I noticed fresh, glistening wetness spotting the tattered jumpsuit below its left clavicle, but it wasn't blood red but as green as an emerald. Was that its blood? Had it been injured, and was it now deceased? Was I safe to investigate further and get a closer look? And would I be safe should I choose not to do those things and just run away back to the house and never look back? These thoughts and so many more raced through my mind in a matter of seconds and played over and over again on a seemingly never-ending reel. I was in shock and experiencing pure terror unlike anything I had ever experienced before. Space. I needed space. Scrambling backwards down twisting branches seemed to take hours. Reason battling the shock and screaming for me to run now and seek answers later. I hit the ground at a stumbling run, careful not to go anywhere near the creature that had been lying at the foot of the same tree the others seemed to have fallen into and died. I ran back to my house with all of the same questions racing through my mind and with the knowledge somewhere inside of me that I was more than likely being followed by the creature's companions. But where had they been? Should I try to go back with supplies and render any aid to them? Would they take or need the same sort of help as human beings would? I stood just inside of the glass sliding door in my kitchen that faced out into the wilderness, and I wondered if perhaps some ship had crashed there, and if those things were what had been watching me from outside my window that night before. I decided I couldn't just sit around and do nothing but understand I didn't know what to do at all and didn't have the slightest clue what I was dealing with. I grabbed a first aid kit and an old camera, realizing I had left mine hanging from a branch in the tree I had climbed down before making a run for it. I made it back to the same spot quicker than I had ever made it there before, from the distance of my house, and I looked up and saw the body of the creature there. I looked back down and fumbled with the camera for about 10 seconds, just checking to make sure it had film in it and was ready to go. I looked back up through the lens of the camera but saw nothing. Where had it gone? I looked all around and even ran over to where the other one had been lying on the ground mere seconds earlier. It wasn't there either. The entities had vanished soundlessly as though they had both been dissolved by the sunlight. There had been no breeze that day that would have caused any leaves to be falling from the trees or the branches to sway. And yet that's what they were doing. These creatures had been moved by something else or moved on their own. Something primal inside of me registered instantly that I was now in danger. I had seen too much and they knew it, whoever they were. Gripping my camera and ready to snap a shot at even the slightest of movements, I stumbled forward, seeking any sort of confirmation as to what I had just seen and experienced. There, amid the grass and fallen leaves, right next to where the first one I saw had been lying and directly under and to the left a few inches of where the one in the tree had been seemingly stuck, there was a perfect circle, perhaps 6 feet in diameter. It was scorched into the earth, and everything very close to it and right underneath it had also been scorched. It was a telltale indicator of the bizarre travelers and possibly how they had gotten there and where they went. How did they disappear right under my nose, though? I have no clue, but I bet the ship, or whatever else it could have been, that scorched and burned the earth like that had something to do with it. If that was the case, then where had the initial craft been while I had been there all day, coming and going from that spot? I don't have any answers to these questions, but they still haunt me all of these years later. I staggered closer, snapping photos of the impossible yet undeniable proof. This had been no hallucination and no dream. Not this swath of withered vegetation exactly matching where the delicate being had been, and it led me to believe it had watched me come and go earlier, but of course, I can't prove that. The charred remnants of foliage were still smoldering faintly, and that's one of the things that bothers me the most. They had to have landed the night before, and maybe that's what woke me up in the first place, or maybe that's even what caused the nightmares. Did they pay me a visit? Had they come specifically for me, but then something went wrong, or was it just that mine is the only house for several miles and I was the only human being in their midst? Maybe they wanted to make sure that I was tucked into bed and unaware of whatever they had been doing out there, or whatever had happened out there. I still have those pictures, and sometimes my own self-doubt erodes my memories. And I know that sometimes fear distorts even the most evident truths. I feel adamant that I know what happened most of the time, but sometimes I get scared of the implications and decide I'm overreacting and that some natural phenomenon happened that I simply am not intelligent or educated enough to understand or know about. I couldn't part with my family home and ended up paying my mother for it, purchasing it myself. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, convinced implacable darkness is spreading outside in the woods and waiting just beyond the flimsy walls for me to walk out there and directly into it. But then the daylight always returns, and with it so does my rational thought processes that try desperately to convince me that I didn't have an encounter with extraterrestrials after all, and that everything that happened that day is perfectly ordinary. Somehow. I haven't shied away from that spot, at least not past a few months later, and I still go out there often. The perfect circle is still scorched into the foliage and into the earth, and nothing has ever grown there since. I notice no animals go near that spot either, and have seen more than a few squirrels and rabbits go far out of their way to avoid that one particular spot in all of the woods, in the whole forest. Daylight always returns. I've seen some things there a few times, but I try my best to just accept that I will probably never know what's going on or what in the world is sometimes glimmering there without any real form, but still seemingly able to watch me as it does so from that spot, but only while I'm able to view it in periphery and never straight on. They're still out there and they still watch me. Maybe someday I'll know the answers and the reasons for it all, but for now, that's all I have, and I have no plans of talking about it with anyone or turning that beloved woodland into some sort of freak show for every amateur investigator within a 50-mile radius or further to traipse through there searching for the answers I'm fairly sure they'll never find anyway. Whatever it is will reveal itself when the time is right, and that's the only definite I take from the whole experience and ordeal. It hasn't hurt me yet and has had many chances to do so. So I just coexist and pretend I don't notice it when I do. End quote. So let's move on to the second encounter from Campfire Stories Volume 1. So our next encounter story is called An Unearthly Cry. Quote, I still get chills remembering the cries that echoed around my camp that night up in the mountains. It was the strangest sound, what I thought was a baby wailing real upset out there in all that darkness. I had been around woods and forests my whole life and basically grew up on the side of a mountain where there was nothing else around me. So much about that night was different than anything I had ever experienced, and it honestly took me a while to really understand what was going on and that I wasn't crazy. See, I had taken a temporary work transfer far up north from where I grew up and far away from anywhere I had ever been before. Of course, I'd done my research first and made sure I knew what I was getting into, but when it comes to Mother Nature and all of her beasts, I was more than confident I wouldn't be hurt too badly and that nothing terrible would happen to me even if there had been some sort of emergency situation. By the way, in the decade or so I had been doing this type of work, there had never been any instance where I'd come up against a wild predatory animal that intended to do me or anyone around me harm. Normally, I would get a call to go out to where one was spotted or where a group of them were said to be hurting, and I would get the people moved far enough away to eliminate almost all possibility of there being some sort of incident with them. The area I was transferred to, it's true that there were more wild bears and cougars roaming than people, but I much preferred to be around animals than human beings anyway, so it wasn't a deterrent for me and more like an attraction. I desperately needed to get away for a bit after going through a bad breakup from my girlfriend of 12 years. We'd built a whole world together before things went sour, and it was hard for me to come to terms with the death of all of our future plans. I had no idea what to do with my life without her or what I even wanted to do, so I just figured I would continue doing what I loved professionally and the rest would all eventually fall into place. She moved out into another country to follow her dreams, and I was still staying in the home we had shared and planned our future in for the last 7 years. The cabin fever from being constantly surrounded by all of those memories was too much. My job offered to station me at one of their small regional offices way up north in the middle of nowhere where I could have all the time I needed alone to think. Oh, did I mention my dad worked for the same company for years and left a great legacy, so I'm like a second son to the person who made that decision. Nothing to do with the story, but that's why he agreed so readily and easily to help me with my personal struggles. Now, I was born and raised in the country, but I also had a lot of experience spending time in a big city because a lot of my parents' closest family members lived there. My mom and dad were basically the ones who hadn't gone running out of the forest and off of the farm the minute they got a chance. I'm not easily scared off from dangers of either place, and like I said, I thought I had prepared myself well. I hadn't even considered the paranormal or the supernatural in my preparations because, well, why would I have? The backcountry base camp they sent me to had a nice setup despite it being very small and very basic. Again, though, that's exactly what I was looking for. Something very simple, just a trailer, small kitchen, workstation with a radio and laptop for checking in. There was no cell service at all anywhere near the station, which also didn't matter to me because I had decided to get rid of my cell phone for a while to make sure I didn't make a fool of myself even more than I already had with my now ex-girlfriend. My nearest colleague was stationed over 60 miles west through those big rocky peaks, and they were always streaked with snow. I was hooked up with a big old truck for patrolling around to watch for fires and help lost backpackers. It served its purpose and made it easy for me to do my job. Everything was simple and basic, and I can't even tell you how relieved I was to finally get out there and get started with this new chapter of my life. Also, I didn't worry too much about other people being around because we were so far out in the middle of nowhere, we didn't see many outsiders willingly roaming past where the real remote wilderness kicked in. They gave me a GPS tracker and radios in case of emergencies, but otherwise I was free to pass the lonely off hours journaling at my makeshift campsite, scanning the slopes for wildlife through binoculars, or hiking trails too dicey for ordinary tourists. It was really peaceful having all of that nature spread out around me in every direction, and most of it was just me hearing occasional elk calls or glimpsing hawks surfing warm air currents rising up from the valleys down below. On the evening everything started to get weird, I had cooked up some beans and franks for my little fire pit, watching the sun turn real vivid orange and purple behind the mountains before everything faded to black. A half moon started to give some glow to the ragged silhouettes all around me. Once it got fully dark out there, I doused my fire and was settling into my tent when a dreadful shrieking sound pierced the air and startled the sleep right out of me. It seemed like it was coming from a couple different spots, echoing until it almost felt like I was surrounded by whatever was making the noise. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized how much the crying and shrieking resembled a human baby that was scared and possibly in pain. I was immediately on high alert, and even though it made absolutely no sense that a human baby would be anywhere near where I was immediately convinced that's exactly what it was, and I knew I would stop at nothing until I found it. The baby's shrill cries echoed, seeming to come from all directions in the pitch-black wooded slopes around me. I swept my flashlight beam towards each wail, but only saw thicker pines and shadows dancing wildly out of sight. I didn't have any kids, but the human instinct to protect the vulnerable and distressed clawed inside despite the impossibility of an infant surviving alone out here through frigid mountain nights. I hadn't crossed a single hiker in weeks on those remote trails. I also knew there had been no reports of missing persons or abandoned children crackling over the emergency band in months. I called out gently but loudly as the last long whimper I had heard in the direction it sounded like it was coming from, and I asked where they were and if they were hurt. Then I realized that if it was a baby, it wouldn't be able to answer me. It dawned on me that more than likely a parent or someone else who had been with the baby could have gotten hurt and was with the infant, but had maybe been too seriously hurt to answer. The pleading sounds instantly quieted at the sound of my voice, and I couldn't hear anything at all for several seconds. In the abrupt, heavy silence, a snap of branches whispered from my 9 o'clock. I pivoted, spearheading the area with the sharp LED light until my eyes throbbed, but nothing stirred by the crumbling pine I briefly illuminated except the swaying needles. I couldn't hear anything there, but it certainly looked as though someone or something had been there moving around until the moment my light hit it. Had it only been distressed elk calves separated from their mother? My gut tensed, certain something more unnatural mimicked these cries for attention. Glancing at my watch, I had already spent an hour pursuing the strange sounds. If some abandoned infant miraculously survived exposure, their window was rapidly closing, and if that did turn out to be what had happened, I knew I had to do everything in my power to help it before it was too late. I trudged faster towards the echoes, calling reassurances to whoever it was that could hear me. The beam flashed over claw marks marring tree bark, fresh gouges at odd, unnatural heights. Had a curious bear cub climbed up high and then slid back down? I refused to acknowledge the deeper, spiraling dread as those eerie cries grew louder and louder, but then faded unpredictably. I was starting to feel something unlike I had ever felt before, but I couldn't understand what it was. It was like something wrong was happening all around me, and despite all of the reassurances I was constantly giving myself, I was beginning to feel like I was being lured somewhere. An hour and 20 minutes later, and I was still being led deeper and deeper into the untamed and mostly uncharted wilderness and into areas even I had never wandered into before. The screeching wails suddenly started coming, paired with the rustling of limbs and cracking of twigs and branches underfoot. But underfoot of what or whom? I had no idea, and it was getting to the point I was actually considering just giving up and pretending like I had never heard anything. However, I knew that would have been easier said than done because the sound would not stop, and they weren't going away. The noises, both the wails and the pacing, were always just out of sight of my flashlight beam, and it almost felt like the forest itself was getting darker with each and every step I took. Navigating an especially steep, narrow valley with no clear path in sight, I stumbled over the unexpected lump of a fawn carcass. Shock would have been evident on my face to anyone around me at the time. Heck, it was evident to me, as that was the very last thing I was expecting to see or to trip over all the way out there. I had never in my life seen a deceased animal just lying there rotting before, as if whatever killed it did so only to shed its blood and stop it from being alive and for no real purpose like food or whatever else. It made no sense and really amped up the terror I had already been feeling for quite some time at that point. The young doe's abdomen had been violently split open, and it was almost like it had been killed from the inside out by some powerful slicing swipe. With my breath quickening, I staggered backwards and fell to the ground clumsily. As I got back on my feet, I glimpsed movement in the brush behind the mangled fawn corpse. Still reeling, I had a hard time gaining my balance, and just as I did, my light finally made contact with a crouched figure trying to remain hidden that I instinctively knew had been the one making all of the noises all along. My light trembled over the hunched form, sickly ashen flesh stretched over an elongated spinal ridge, poking through tattered remains of plaid flannel. Lips peeled back from bloodied humanesque teeth grounded my sanity. No natural explanation existed for the humanoid horror in front of me. Its milky eyes led me to believe it was blind, but it seemed like it was staring hungrily right into my soul. Its distended jaw unhinged, releasing the next helpless cry. Air wheezed through an exposed gullet lined in tiny sharp bone fragments poised to hook any passerby towards the same asphyxiating fate, and I knew my initial assessment had been correct. The noise that erupted from its mouth were the sounds I had been following that whole time, all night long. The creature's almost lipless mouth clamped shut as I scrambled backwards and turned to run. It stayed almost on my heels the whole time, but remained in the shadows too, because it wouldn't step out from hiding behind trees or bushes, even as it chased me. If I stopped, it stopped and stayed in hiding. I tried not to stop, of course, but I was confused and had no clue what the hell was going on, and honestly, there was a point there when I thought I was in some sort of waking nightmare. Had I hit my head and found myself in some nightmarish world while also in some coma? The creature seemed to track me not by sight, but by the frantic rhythm of my retreat, by my heartbeat. It was blind, but it was extremely sensitive to the vibrations all around us. Tilting its face as if catching a scent, the freakish thing lurched forward on all fours in my direction, finally fully coming out of the darkness. I crashed recklessly through some underbrush, no longer concerned with stealth, its foreign and torturous-sounding wails echoing from behind and all around me. My spirit and body were dizzy with adrenaline, and I thought I might pass out at any moment. I came to the realization after a while that the unnatural predator could have easily outpaced me on open land, but the broken and somewhat treacherous terrain we were currently playing some sick game of hide-and-seek in seriously slowed its rolling gait. I plunged blindly through razor pine boughs until finally I found the glowing beacon of my tent again. I fumbled numbly at the radio mic with one hand and scanned the tree line, expecting the humanoid monstrosity to come barreling out from the darkness towards me as I stood there, listening to nothing but the sound of my own hammering heartbeat inside of my chest. I breathlessly radioed "Mayday" at my colleague who was stationed miles away, and I did that as I ran breathlessly and terrified towards the emergency trailer. I hadn't ever had the need to stay in the trailer, even at my other jobs doing the same thing, but this time I knew it was the only place I would find safety, and maybe even some solace. I slammed the door and all the locks, including the deadbolt and those on the one lone window in the place once I was inside. The radio crackled back some response from my colleague, but I was in too much of a panic to really have understood what he was saying to me, and I just started telling him all about the fact that I had just come into contact with an alarming and unidentified non-human/humanoid creature that had been able to mimic the cries of hurting human infants. I didn't let him get a word in edgewise until I finished repeating those things to him more than once, and then I urged extreme caution if responding to my distress signal. I once again emphasized the being's freakish physicality and reiterated that he should not mistake what I was reporting to him for my misidentifying some sort of ordinary regional wildlife. I knew what I had heard, what I had seen, and what had happened to me, and I also knew at that point with absolute certainty that I had in fact been lured all the way out there and into a place where it was unlikely anyone would ever find my body, and if they did so, they wouldn't be able to do it easily. Then again, I doubt from what I had seen with that fawn, that nothing much would have been left to find anyway had I not thought fast despite my initial shock and gotten the hell out of there and away from that thing as quickly as I possibly could. I knew as well that the only reason that it hadn't caught me and killed me was because for whatever reason, I still have no idea, it needed to stay in the shadows and didn't seem to be able to attack me outright. My colleague Micah responded with stunned concern over the radio, questioning if I was doing all right after such a bizarre encounter so far removed from any assistance or refuge. He wasn't questioning my sanity because of what I reported having seen, which was more comforting than I would have thought it was, and seemed to have believed me from the very beginning. He genuinely seemed concerned that I keep myself safe from the monstrosity for at least as long as it took for him to make his way to me and render aid in taking it down. I told him again how I had only come into contact with it after it had lured me with the sound of an infant crying in pain and or distress. It had been projecting the noise through the remote mountain valleys. I promised Micah I would remain barricaded inside of the trailer and planned to stay there until he found his way to me. He assured me he was mobilizing to my location, armed to the teeth with heavy protective weaponry. I warned him one more time that the creature seemed cunningly aware when prey retreated to safer shelters, and that I thought for sure that its disembodied cries would continue haunting the landscape like a siren song to lure the unaware towards evisceration. Meaning, he needed to be careful and go against every single instinct and ounce of humanity in him so that he could understand it wasn't a baby or even a human person in need of help or medical attention. It was an unearthly creature, the likes of which I had never seen or heard of before in my real life, and that I possibly hadn't even ever seen in the most monstrous and terrifying of horror movies. I remained huddled in the locked trailer, and my terror was almost amplified by the seemingly unearthly silence all around me. No matter how intently I listened, I couldn't hear anything outside, but I knew deep down inside, in my gut, and the most primal place of instinct in my body, that the hideous creature was patiently pacing around and lurking right outside of that trailer, but in the shadows along the tree lines. I had no contact with Micah anymore for what seemed like an eternity, and when there was finally a knock on the trailer door, it came so suddenly that I jumped like a scared child and let out a little shriek along with it. It was Micah. I opened the door and quickly pulled him inside with me. I must have looked crazed, but he didn't seem to notice, as he immediately started telling me that he began hearing the same sounds I had described to him the moment he got within a few miles of my location. But they stopped just as suddenly as they had started when he fired a few shots off in the air. I hadn't even heard the shots, but that's to be expected with how out of my mind and delirious I was. We got the hell out of there and drove directly to the main base where we reported in at with the head bosses once a month to report whatever was happening to us. The head guy for the company looked at us like we were nuts and offered us some time off, but the oddest thing was that the other 5 people there who held similar positions to mine and Micah's didn't seem so shocked or surprised at all. They looked at one another with knowing glances, but they never said anything to us. We wrote the report and were almost immediately sent back to our posts. It was like our boss didn't want to know what was actually going on and would rather just not talk about it or not even know about it for that matter. I've heard the sounds a few times in the 2 years I stayed at that post, but no one else ever mentioned it, and Micah quit within a week of rescuing me. He's never spoken to me about it, but I always knew he had come face to face with the same creature. There's nothing I can find about it online, and though I don't work in that same area anymore, I still hold a similar position in the middle of nowhere in a forest and spend most of my time patrolling alone. I believe whatever that thing was came either from another world or possibly from somewhere underground. And I know most people won't believe me, but I also know that there are people who have had similar experiences with similar creatures in the woods, and those are the people I aim to reach with my encounter. They're not alone. Thanks for letting me share this and get it off my chest. It's been a really long time, but I still can't hear the sound of a baby crying without feeling sick to my stomach, and I believe that's one of the main reasons I decided not to ever have children." End quote. In our last campfire story for today, I was going to cover some from both books, but the video is getting really long and I still want to do my 2 most recent books, Gone Mysterious Disappearances. So the last one today is, I think, probably one of my absolute favorites from either volume, and it's from volume 1 and it's called Invisible Terror. Quote, "When I was 10 years old, my father and I went out into the woods that surrounded our isolated farmhouse and built a treehouse. My older siblings helped, but being teenagers, they really didn't have much use for it. It was mainly for me and my friends, and we had so many fun and memorable times in the treehouse. It really became a sacred place for me, one of refuge and solitude. I promised my dad I would take really great care of it, and I did, because even at that young age, I appreciated it and knew none of my friends had their own giant treehouse to go to whenever they wanted. They had to borrow mine, which I mostly let them do. Over the years, I outfitted the wooden platform tucked high up in an old maple tree with cast-off cushions, battery-powered light, and shelves of favorite books. My mom made me curtains, and I basically furnished it from cast-off furniture and anything I was allowed to take from the house and my own bedroom. I felt like a king when I was out there, and I would often spend the night for no reason other than I felt grown up and seriously enjoyed being out in that forest alone. It was magical to me, and still to this day, I find there's nothing quite like it, even with what happened to me that night. In the end, it was basic but cozy, removed from the chaos of my life, and as I got older, it became a way for me to get away from my increasingly guilt-tripping parents and the popularity contest pressure at school, and even at home with my older siblings who were still in the house at the time. I was the youngest, and eventually it was only me and my folks. I felt small in my house, but out in the treehouse, I could pretend to command a tiny kingdom, free from social stresses for at least a few hours or a night or two at a time. Shortly after my 18th birthday, it snowed about 3 feet, and my parents and I had gotten into a pretty serious argument. Well, it was serious at the time. Looking back now, it seems like it was rather petty and all my fault. The stupid fight was actually about my college plans, or lack thereof, that inevitably devolved into another lecture on wasted potential. My blood was still boiling as I stomped across the crunchy yard to my sanctuary. I knew rich hot cocoa and Tolkien would ease my irritation, if not resolve the underlying source tormenting me. But I had no way of knowing that unexpected visitors were lurking somewhere out of sight and far out of my perception, and they were sure to bring about even more lasting emotional scars. The first thing that struck me as odd happened right away, the moment I crossed the threshold of the tree line bordering my parents' house from the forest itself. There was an odd and unusual silence that seemed to overtake the entire forest and all of the normal nocturnal noises and activities which I were very used to at the time. Not a single owl hooted, and not even the squirrels were running around fighting for food to forage. Sounds familiar. The complete and total silence around me seemed creepy and eerie, so I went about making my hot chocolate so I can calm myself down. I needed to do that even more because on top of being angry with my parents, I was really uncomfortable in the forest for the first time in my life. I knew something was very wrong, but I didn't want to have to think about it. So I tried to just go about my business as usual and pretend like everything was perfectly normal and ordinary. It didn't last long. As I stood there, a volley of sharp clicks that seemed to be coming from directly above the treehouse pierced through the stillness and the silence. I froze right there, clutching my mug of cocoa and holding on to it as though my life depended on it. In all of my years of spending time and often whole nights out there, I had never come across any dangerous predators or anything else that was even remotely scary. Also, I was familiar with all of the animals in the region. It was just something I knew because I had been taught all about the wilderness, the animals in that forest in particular, from a very young age. Before the treehouse, there were a lot of camping trips out there. The rattling was somewhat rhythmic, but more than that, there shouldn't have been anything out there that could not only climb trees, but scale the branches that were layered with ice at the time, all the way up to the top. I ran out onto the little porch and shined my flashlight all around, trying to determine the source. Everything looked and sounded the same, except of course for the odd clicking coming now from all directions in several spots in trees around the woods. Before I could even put my flashlight away, seemingly as soon as the light hit the tops of the trees, the strange clicks faded. They took the last little bit of my courage with them, and the absolute aloneness and vulnerability of the situation I was in almost sent me into a total panic. I quickly ran back inside and closed the curtains. I laid in the dark and listened for a while, but tried to just calm myself in the hopes I would just fall asleep and wake up when the sun rose so I could leave. The warmth inside of the treehouse was enough to take the chill out of my bones, but it did nothing to comfort me. I was terrified of whatever was beyond those wooden walls that seemed thinner and thinner the longer I sat there and thought about it. I was actually sitting there straining my ears with all my might for the slightest familiarity in the silence outside. I longed to hear a cricket or even something falling from the trees, the wind, anything. But there was nothing out there for me to hear, or whatever was out there I couldn't hear. I tried to remember the last time I had heard the crickets at all, but couldn't. I was filled with claustrophobia instead of my usual enjoyment of that refuge. Up until that point, it had been almost sacred to me. Now it was like I was trapped in a nightmare with no way of waking up or getting out. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep right then, and so I got up and went to sit on my comfortable chair and had to really try to keep myself from pacing. I looked out the window again into the silence at a little past midnight. My fire was still lit, and it shone just enough light so I could see the stealthy, somewhat human-looking footprints circling all around it. My heart sank. I knew there hadn't been footprints there before, which meant that those things had come back looking for me, or for some other reason I couldn't even guess at. Either that, or they had been there all along and I was losing my mind. I really don't think I'd seen them though, and it made sense because they fled at the brightness of the artificial LED light I turned on them. So once it was dark, they came skulking and sneaking back to my camp. Were they still there? Where? How would I even know if they didn't move or make any sounds? The terror amped up immediately with those thoughts, and there was no comforting answer that I could give myself, at least not an honest one. There were no owls out hooting and no rodents scurrying around, dodging their dives from above either. With nothing natural moving, I started to wonder what sort of unnatural things were lurking. Before I could even finish that thought, my adrenaline spiked and I realized I heard what sounded like slow and deliberate steps coming towards the treehouse and coming from the woods. Each step sounded much louder than it should have as they echoed through the empty forest and crunched through the deliberate snowfall. The footsteps stopped for only a minute or two. As I listened, I heard them, whatever they were, encircling my treehouse. The treehouse, which had always seemed so massive and hardy, now felt like nothing more than a mere sheet of paper standing between me and some sort of otherworldly malevolent entity that had who knows what intentions with me. The footfalls were so heavy and deliberate that I knew it wasn't any sort of animal or other furry forager. These were purposeful in their navigation, moving all around my former sanctuary. The curtains on the other window were frost crisped as I pulled back a corner of one. I hoped and prayed with all my might that I couldn't see anything that would confirm my greatest fears and what my ears had already told me was happening. The glass looked cracked with the way the snow and ice formed on it, and it was harder to see than the other window. I scanned the woods and looked as close to the cabin as I could see from where I was standing. Still nothing but the snow-covered and barren stillness was visible, and yet, somehow, the steady and deliberate crunching continued, though it sounded strangely muted except for the snow-covered branches swaying directly underneath me. I couldn't see what it was, but its passage was betrayed nonetheless. Thank God it was. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight and constricted with the weight of my fear as I peered through the icy windows at the ropes and planks holding up my once secure treehouse sanctuary, which was now almost trembling itself underneath the weight of an invisible prowler. I just kept thinking, this can't be real. This cannot be happening. This isn't happening. Then it dawned on me. What if one of my siblings were playing a prank on me? My best friend Jake had done things like that before when he would call and my parents would tell him I was out at the treehouse. He would sneak into the area and cause all sorts of mischief. Granted, it had never been anything where he kept me in intense terror at all, let alone for as long as I had been dealing with it now. I had bailed on going to a lame party with him recently. Maybe this was his revenge. There was definitely something out there, of that I was sure. I couldn't see whoever it was from where I was standing, but I saw everything swaying and moving around exactly the way it would if someone were walking on or by it. I just didn't have a good enough vantage point. My mind suddenly jumped to the possibility that it was some vagrants and they had found my secluded house in the middle of nowhere and were going to break in and harm me in some way. I had to go out there and confront whoever it was, but with all the thoughts having been turned to a human intruder, I felt at least a little more emboldened to do so. I leaned towards the nearest icy window pane and squinted downwards against the feeble backlight. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with anything I was familiar with, and that whatever it was, it definitely wasn't human. A faint, elongated shape slowly moved around the otherwise undisturbed, snow-covered ground about 20 feet below where I was standing. From where I was peeking out, all I could really see was a fast blur of movement that barely left prints in the fresh powder before stopping suddenly. Even though I was shining my flashlight everywhere as soon as it stopped, there was nothing actually visible there. But I swear I felt something staring right up at me from that spot, like this creepy, intense focus coming from somewhere in the dark. I waved my light around more, but couldn't see any eyes or make out any face at all in that direction, but I just knew something was there watching me. Once again, everything fell into a deep and eerie silence except for my heavy breathing. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I heard a loud thud. It sounded like something with weight to it had hit the packed snow below. I ran as fast as I could back to the window to look down, needing to see what the heavy thump was after withdrawing the ladder. Had the climbing creature fallen? My heart raced, both terrified to spot it below, yet also oddly desperate to finally glimpse whatever had been stalking me. Time almost stood still as I stood there just for a second, staring down into the dark. I was only a little bit surprised when a vicious snarl ripped from the shadows, and it was answered by other guttural howls surrounding my treehouse. I felt so exposed, even though the treehouse was still hiding me, or so I hoped. Every pine began violently shaking, dumping snow as things too fast to follow raced through their branches. It was just like it had been before, only it somehow seemed more violent. I knew that whatever was stalking me had not come alone. How many of them were there? I couldn't tell and wasn't really sure if I wanted to know. Suddenly, it sounded like 100 rabid creatures were grinding metallic teeth right outside the treehouse walls. The horrifying sound got louder, almost like an army whipping itself into a starving frenzy. But what were they hungry for? I shuddered at the thought and burst into tears. I felt so small, so scared, and though I had been alone out there many times before, I hadn't ever felt so isolated as I did in that moment. I couldn't muffle my whimpering anymore against the sleeves of my hoodie, which I had clamped across my mouth. Through the frosty window, I glimpsed powder blowing sideways, but it seemed to be coming off of nowhere. It was just there, hovering in the air and blowing away. The entities weren't visible except for when they were covered in snow. I have thought about this so many times since then, and I realized that it was the snow more than anything else that more than likely saved my life that night. I knew with every breath and bone in my body that those things were poised and ready to shred apart the walls of my treehouse. It was the only barrier keeping them from me, from their now cornered prize. I looked over and saw my heavy flashlight and made a desperate move towards it, needing some idea what I was actually up against. I couldn't let it go. Sprinting the few steps to the opposite window pane, I swung the ultra-bright beam out into the woods, bracing for a battle. My heart sank again, and a whimper escaped my throat as I realized there were no weapons on Earth that could match the impossible spectacle my flashlight had just revealed to me. They were seemingly braced for battle, and I knew that not only because I could see enough of their form to be able to determine the battle-ready stance they were all in, but because I somehow could feel them, and I knew they were excited. They were frustrated, but they figured they had already won. They were just toying with me at that point. The very fast clicking started almost instantly when the light hit them and I saw them start moving, barreling up the enormous trunk of one of the oak trees. It was a writhing mob of translucent humanoids climbing and trying to get back up into the treehouse. They were going to kill me, or worse. They had ape-like dexterity, and yet their limbs all looked very human. 2 legs and 2 arms with hands and what looked like extremely large feet. Their hands didn't look exactly like human beings do, but every part of them seemed like it was from some sort of alternate kind of human being. Everything looked bigger and bulkier on them, but it all still looked pretty familiar. Their heads were the shape of a light bulb, and they even looked like they had hair, albeit in a dreadlock style, and hung high on their heads. I didn't know the word predator entity when all of this happened, but I would later see these exact entities in a fictional movie produced in the 1980s. That's another story altogether. My reaction when I looked over and saw one of the translucent creatures from that night at the treehouse on the screen, as if it weren't real and some Hollywood schlub made it all up. Anyway, back to that night. It was like they were more practiced at being in the trees and slinging themselves around the branches than in being on the ground or even walking. I recklessly aimed my flashlight all around, and they actually kept on retreating. Before I knew what was happening, and as I stood on the small planked area outside that I always referred to as the porch, I watched as they fled. Utter darkness and silence fell down all around me all at once, and I was alone and vulnerable once again. I dropped to my knees and cried like a baby, the tears freezing on my cheeks as I did so. Eventually, and I don't know how long I kneeled there, I got up and went back inside the treehouse. I couldn't walk through the forest by myself at night, not after what I had just seen. I barricaded the door with the only furniture I had and laid down in the middle of the floor, rocking back and forth and crying until sleep finally overtook me. I didn't think I was going to be able to sleep after what had happened to me, but I think the adrenaline itself was enough to make me crash sleep once it was no longer spiking every 2 seconds. I had terrible nightmares about those creatures gaining entry and either eating me, feeding off my energy, and even one where they carried me through the trees and with them and took me to a spaceship. I woke up to the brightness of the sun and the sound of the birds singing and squirrels restlessly trying to forage for scraps of food. I was desperate to get out of there, and I immediately jumped up and moved all the furniture away from the door. I jumped down off the precipice and almost twisted an ankle. I looked around, and all the footprints from the night before had seemingly been covered up with fresh snow. That was until I started running home, and about 10 feet away from the treehouse in the middle of some thick shrubbery, I saw more footprints that were definitely fresher. They would have been covered up had they been there since the time when I had the confrontation with the creatures. I ran home and I didn't look back. I didn't spend too many nights in the treehouse after that, but believe it or not, after about a year passed, it's like my mind forgot the terror of facing those entities coming and carrying me swiftly through the trees to their cloaked and awaiting craft. I always wake up just as we get there. I know that experience itself was real, absolutely. The issue I have, or I guess I should say that what I wonder the most about, is those abduction nightmares. The more I research, the more I start to believe that they were extraterrestrials and that they ended up getting what they wanted in the end anyway. They had just changed their strategy once I became aware of them. I also see that many more people are encountering this entity in the woods in recent years, and I would encourage them to get away as fast as possible and not try to figure out what they're dealing with. If I learned nothing else from my experience about them, it's that they're evil and have nothing but nefarious purposes for human beings. Their hatred was palpable, and I write this to warn you. End quote. Now let's move on to Gone Mysterious Disappearances Volumes 1 and 2. Obviously, starting with Volume 1, which you guys made a bestseller for me. So I'm trying to get Volume 2 there as well. I don't have a physical copy of Volume 1, but I do have Volume 2 right here. This is what it looks like. Gone Mysterious Disappearances Volume 2 is the continuation of the enthralling book series that delves into the chilling and unresolved mysteries of people who had vanished without a trace over the years. Each volume in the series explores a collection of famous and lesser-known disappearances, presenting the known facts with a gripping narrative style that brings the stories to life. So there we go on that. So let's jump right into our first case. So I am choosing these randomly, guys. I'm just typing in the name of the book and the volume into my saved documents, and the first 3 that pop up are the first 3 we're going to cover. So the first one that popped up is Eric Lewis. On July 1st, 2010, 57-year-old Eric Lewis was mountain climbing at Mount Rainier in Washington State. He was accompanied by 2 men, his climbing companions Don Storm Jr. and Trevor Lane. The climb leader was Don Storm, and the men were heading towards the summit through what's known as Gibraltar Ledges. Following Don in line on the climbing rope was Trevor Lane in the middle, and then Eric Lewis last at the bottom. Due to very high winds and low visibility, the 3 of them decided that they would move and climb more efficiently if they were to tether themselves together. Once they reached approximately 13,900 feet up the side of the mountain, they decided to regroup, take a break, and talk about what their next move was going to be. Don and Trevor, having just glimpsed Eric seconds earlier right below them, pulled themselves over onto the side and waited for him to show up. He never did. They pulled the rope up, and instead of finding their climbing companion, they found a butterfly knot, and it looked to both of them like he had either unclipped or cut himself free of the rope for unknown reasons. The other 2 men were surprised, but figured there was a rational explanation for why he wasn't there, and figuring they'd find him quickly, as there weren't really too many places where he could have gone, they searched for him right away. After all, there had only been mere seconds since the last time they had seen him, when they looked down from where they were through the mist and saw him at the bottom of that rope. However, there was no sign of him downhill, near the summit, or anywhere else for that matter. So, and not wanting to waste any more time and thinking that their friend could be in some real danger or trouble, Don and Trevor decided to go back to base camp and notify the Rangers. An immediate, full-scale search was launched, as was a search and rescue effort, but it was all to no avail. Despite how much snow was on the ground, the only footprints of Eric's that were found were the ones from when he had been following his climbing companions up the mountain in the first place, before he had mysteriously gone missing. There were no signs that he had decided to break off from the group and go anywhere on his own, no signs that he had wandered off or that he had turned back. Eric Lewis had simply ceased to exist, or seemingly so anyway. With all the snow on the ground, there should have been at least some additional footprints showing which way Eric had gone, and if he had fallen, then his body should have immediately been located on the ground below where the other 2 had last seen him. However, there was none of that, and not a single clue was left behind as to where Eric Lewis ended up. Eric's backpack, climbing harness, and a snow shovel were found in a snow cave at an altitude of about 13,600 feet. Once again, though, there were no further clues as to where he ended up or whatever became of him. No new information has been uncovered, and no new leads have turned up in regards to this case, and to this day, Eric Lewis remains a missing person. One of the main questions we ask in the paranormal community is what could have possibly happened to him that the regular investigators didn't think of. I discussed this case, not by name, but in a generalized way in my book, Missing the Fae Theory. And I did so with the thought that maybe it was the Fae who had something to do with this strange and very tragic disappearance. Could these men have been encroaching on Fae territory and they decided to retaliate? But why would they only choose Eric when he was there with 2 other people? Well, I've come to learn through all of my research that the Fae are only attracted to certain people, and others they couldn't care less about encountering. I couldn't possibly know why this is, or what it is that makes some people more desirable targets than others, but one thing I think is that it has something to do with possessing something we have no control over, but that the fairies want or see as very valuable. Also, and I didn't put this here, but I should have, they're known to go after the last person in line, even when people are walking. There was never a body found in this case and no footprints leading anywhere. It's not out of the realm of possibility, at least for what we are discussing here, that the Fae left his belongings behind when they took him. Maybe he saw them coming and cut his own rope to try to escape them. How else would it be that he didn't make a single sound and seemingly no movements that would alert his friends to the fact that something was wrong? At the very least, he could have tugged on the rope to alert them, but there was absolutely nothing. When the Fae sees something in a human being that they want, they will take it without hesitation. Therefore, I personally believe that some fairies spotted Eric, and he either tried to cut himself free before they could get to him, or they grabbed him and cut him loose themselves and then abducted him. The Fae live both in this world and in their own dimension, so more than likely he was taken there. For what purpose, I surely have no idea, but that's just one of many theories I have about this particular case. One other thing I thought about was how badly something would have had to have scared him for him to cut himself loose and try to free fall 13,600 feet to the ground, only for him to not make it to the ground. Could this have been the work of extraterrestrials using cloaking technology, as I've seen them do time and again in many missing in the woods type cases? Absolutely. There's really no limit to the possibilities when using a supernatural lens to view this case as to what could have happened that day to Eric Lewis. Kenneth Scott Reed. Born on July 31st, 1964, Kenneth Scott Reed dropped out of high school in the 8th grade and joined adult schools to try to obtain an equivalency diploma, but because of his dedication to the job he was working at the time for BB Dairy, he wasn't able to keep up with schoolwork. He started working at a restaurant called The Dairy in 1981 and had started working there as a dishwasher. Since he was such a dedicated and hard worker, he quickly rose the ranks at the dairy and became an assistant manager. Everyone who knew him, including his many co-workers, said that Kenneth was fun-loving and responsible, and before he went missing, he had a perfect attendance record at his job and hadn't ever missed a single day in 8 years. Until, that is, he went missing. Kenneth shared a roommate at his apartment on Halls Avenue in Colchester, but often stayed the night at his parents' house because it was so much closer to his beloved job. His mother was disabled, and even when he wasn't spending the night in order to go to work the next morning, being the wonderful and caring son that he was, Kenneth also stopped by to see his parents for no reason, too. Ray Skidgel was a longtime friend of Kenneth Reed's, and he would tell investigators that sometimes Kenneth got bored with his job at the dairy and would occasionally become depressed, but that it never lasted very long. Ray said Kenneth would also say to him, quote, "Ray, I don't know," end quote, which presumably meant that he didn't know what exactly to do with his life and or that he wasn't sure about continuing his work at the dairy. It's unknown exactly what Kenneth meant when he said those sorts of things to his friends because there was no elaboration given with the quotes. Kenneth had no criminal record or history, loved sports, and was known as something of a ladies' man, though he hadn't had a steady girlfriend in several years at the time of his disappearance. In the week before Kenneth disappeared, he was threatened twice. The first time was on March 16th when he approached someone who had worked at the dairy restaurant for many years, but whom Kenneth had chosen to fire. The man agreed to resign by the end of the week, but he wasn't happy about it and ended up making threats towards Kenneth because of the altercation. However, the employee started to become very aggressive, throwing things around the restaurant and at Kenneth himself, and so he was asked to leave by Ken, who was the manager at the time. Kenneth had also been threatened around that same time by the new boyfriend of a woman he had previously dated. It's unclear, but some people speculated that Kenneth had dated the woman while she was still dating the other man, the one who had made the threats, but that's never been proven. The woman said she had spoken to Kenneth a short while before he had disappeared and that he told her he was depressed, but that he didn't elaborate as to why. On March 24th, 1989, Kenneth clocked out of work as usual at 3:26 p.m. The manager at the restaurant, a man named Michael Thorne, said that although Ken seemed tired, he expressed his excitement for an upcoming 10-day vacation he had planned for himself. His brother Donald said that Ken had consulted with Sunnyside of Travel, which was an agency in Ledyard, Connecticut, but that he hadn't made any formal arrangements to go anywhere. Kenneth also hadn't mentioned that he was planning on going anywhere during his 10-day vacation to anyone in his family, and they all believed that's something he definitely would have mentioned. The manager noted that though he didn't think it was too strange at the time, after all was said and done, and Kenneth was officially a missing person, he realized it was odd that 5 acquaintances of Ken Reed's had come into the restaurant to speak to him the last day he was there. None of those people had ever come in before, and so thinking back, he thought it was very strange. Kenneth told Michael that he would be in work 45 minutes early the next day to help him with the general daily duties of the restaurant. One of the waitresses there, a woman named Jeanne Bessett, said that on his last day of work, Kenneth had agreed to meet her and several other work acquaintances at the Norwich Sheraton that night, but that he never showed up. It had been pouring rain all day long, so they all thought he simply didn't want to go out in that weather. After he clocked out and left his job for the day, Kenneth stopped and got himself a coffee at a nearby donut shop and then went to his parents' house in Norwich, Connecticut. Kenneth's father saw him parking his gray 4-door Isuzu I-Mark in front of their house, but he went back inside quickly before Kenneth came in due to the heavy rainfall. Kenneth never made it inside his parents' house, though, and he hasn't been seen or heard from since. Kenneth Scott Reed had seemingly disappeared off the face of the earth within 15 minutes of leaving his job. Either a neighbor or a friend who was living with the family, there are sources that say both, noticed that Kenneth's car was left parked but blocking his parents' cars in the driveway. Ray Skidgel said, quote, "When it comes to his coffee, no matter what the circumstances, he will drink his coffee," end quote, and was seemingly referring to the fact that the coffee was left undrunk in or on top of the vehicle. Ray also made comments telling investigators that Kenneth never blocked his parents' driveway and that he always locked his car doors, which made it all even stranger as he had blocked the driveway that time and left the vehicle unlocked just before he vanished. There was no indication that any struggle had taken place at the scene. Kenneth wasn't reported as missing until 3 days after he actually disappeared, and that report was made on the 27th of March. His parents explained that they had waited because they thought that he might have just been friends or had gone off for a few days with a woman, which wasn't unusual for him. They said that although Kenneth often left without telling anyone, he would always show back up within a day or two, but that this time everything was different and so many things just seemed off. Those closest to him reported that Ken seemingly had no personal problems and that he didn't seem to be afraid of anyone in the days leading up to his disappearance. He didn't have any issues with substance abuse, and it was very much out of character for him to just leave and take off for days without telling anyone about it. Kenneth's brother Donald took 3 weeks off of work once his brother was officially reported as missing, and he spent that whole time looking for him. He called and communicated with the media to get the word out, and he also consulted a psychic who claimed to have had 2 visions of the missing man. One psychic's vision was about him being in a blue Plymouth Valiant, and another said he was in a blue Firebird. Law enforcement interviewed and spoke with about a total of 20 people, most of them Kenneth's friends and family members. They searched all over Norwich and investigated the threats Ken had received in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. 2.5 weeks after he went missing, the police took 2 German Shepherds with them to the woods to search along a river near his parents' home. There had been previous searches done by friends and family in that area, but nothing had come from them, and the searches of that area by police dogs also hadn't yielded any evidence. They eventually searched the banks of the Yantic River, but no evidence was further found there either. Law enforcement released a nationwide bulletin regarding Kenneth's disappearance, and they even searched several areas using helicopters, but no clues as to where Kenneth had disappeared to have ever been uncovered. On November 24th, Kenneth was profiled on Crime Stoppers 800. The show was broadcast in 125 television stations, or 87% of the United States. The show followed Connecticut State Police Detective Larry Jabalt as he retraced the last known details of the events that led to Kenneth's disappearance. It also included a reenactment of the crime. He commented, quote, "This man has been missing for 19 months with no trace whatsoever. In the 50 or 60 people we talked with, we haven't come up with anything. We're just trying to perk up interest in the case and keep people talking about it," end quote. Kenneth's mother, Esther, said she had no interest in watching it and said, quote, "I'm not going to watch it because I'll break," end quote. She said it was just too painful for her to have to think about and relive that whole experience. It had been approximately 8 months since Kenneth had first gone missing, and she could not deal with another letdown. She said she had too many remaining questions, and his smile haunted her. Matt James, the executive producer, said the show had a 40% chance of producing more information. Nothing ever came of any of those efforts either, and Kenneth's disappearance still eluded everyone involved. Law enforcement officials still believe there's a chance that foul play is involved in his disappearance, but there's been no evidence to prove or disprove that there was. There's simply nothing to go on, and every lead turns up nothing new. Cindy Paquette works for BB Dairy in Waterford, Connecticut, and is the woman who originally hired Kenneth as a dishwasher when he was just 16 years old, and she commented about the case that, quote, "Nothing ever made sense. I saw him grow from a young kid into a very responsible adult. He wasn't into drugs. He wasn't a playboy by any means. He was an inner city kid who made it out. At the time, he was due for a vacation," end quote. Lawrence Reed was quoted as stating, quote, "I think he's alive out there someplace. He doesn't strike me as someone who can be taken out that easily," end quote. Kenneth left behind a brand new stereo system, and his bank account has never been touched after he went missing. His vacation pay is still waiting for him to this day. Kenneth Scott Reed is a Caucasian male and described as having a dark complexion. At the time of his disappearance, he weighed between 140 and 150 pounds, was described as having a medium build, and stood at 5 foot 8 inches tall. He had blonde hair and brown eyes. When he went missing, he had a dark-colored mustache. Though dental and fingerprint records aren't available in this case, DNA records are. He is 59 years old as of February 2024 and was last seen wearing gray pants and white Nike Air Jordan sneakers with blue stripes. He is classified as an endangered missing person. I specifically wanted to include this case in this book to show that these types of disappearances don't only happen when someone is out and about in the wilderness. It happens in all different types of places all over the world every single day. Could this case have some foul play involved? Absolutely it could, but there's also something else to consider. How did a whole grown man just seemingly evaporate into thin air while exiting his vehicle? He left behind his favorite beverage and he left his car sort of just sitting there. To me, this seems like a case where he got out of his car, possibly because he saw something strange and had every intention of getting back into the vehicle and parking it properly as he always did, and of drinking his coffee. This could very well be another case of an abduction by one of the cloaked extraterrestrial ships that just hover just inside and oftentimes just above our atmosphere. I wish I knew what it was about the missing that are abducted by extraterrestrials that they're the ones that are chosen specifically. Or could it be that they're just victims of opportunity and circumstance? Maybe he saw the craft or a being, he could have really seen anything, and he slowly tried to make his way to see what it was that he was looking at, and then he was taken. I can't say for sure, obviously, but this one really made me think about how little most of the world's population really knows about what's out there all around them that they aren't even aware of, and that's such a danger to them and to the lives they're living. So guys, this video is looking pretty long, so I'm going to do two quick ones from Gone Mysterious Disappearances Volume 2 and wrap it up. And I hope y'all have stayed with me, and I hope y'all will go and purchase Campfire Stories Volume 1 and 2 and Gone Mysterious Disappearances Volume 1 and 2. The details, the links will be in the description box. So our first of the two stories we're going to cover from Gone Mysterious Disappearances Volume 2, my newest book, is Jerry Lee Huffman. On August 5th, 1948, 3-year-old Jerry Lee Huffman was playing with his dog, a collie named Laddie, outside in the yard of his home in Philo, Ohio. Philo is 10 miles southeast of Zanesville and just 60 miles west of the Pennsylvania border. At around 6 that evening, Jerry's father, Dan Huffman, went outside to get his son to tell him to come inside, but there was no sign of either Jerry or Laddie anywhere. Mr. Huffman searched the entire perimeter of his farm, and though he couldn't find his son, he did find Jerry's clothes at the far end of the property. Obviously concerned, Dan called the authorities and reported his son as missing. The state police and the local sheriff responded to the Huffman's home and immediately put together an extensive search effort. 200 friends and neighbors volunteered to help search for the lost little boy, and they all immediately spanned out into the massive cornfields to try and see if they could find him. They were calling out his name and calling for Laddie, and despite no one receiving any answers that night, the search continued on all throughout the night and into the early morning hours of the next day. At 6 a.m. on August 6th, Laddie the collie walked up to the house, and after calming it down a bit, Dan Huffman asked the pet to take him to Jerry Lee. He and a neighbor followed the dog for a full 1.5 miles down the road, and they went across an adjacent cornfield and came to a wire fence. Once they got to that wire fence, the men found Jerry Lee with his foot caught in the fence and with a wild grapevine wrapped around his neck. The 3-year-old was barely conscious and turning blue, plus he was naked outside in the 55 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. Jerry Lee was brought to Bethesda Hospital, and he was found to be in okay condition, meaning he would survive the ordeal with little to no permanent damage. However, Jerry Lee never spoke about the incident and never told anyone how he had gotten so far away, how he had come to have the wild vine around his neck, or how he came to have his foot caught in the fence that way. I know this is a short case, but let's look a little further. Here is yet another instance where a small child who wouldn't know any better was seemingly lured off somewhere for some unknown reason by some unknown force or entity. It's different in that the dog was easily able to make its way back to the child when the father asked it to, but still in all, there are a lot of questions here. As far as I know, most 3-year-olds are not just going to go wandering off their family's property and into an unknown and creepy cornfield for no good reason. If he had been taken by a person, then why did that person leave him there in that condition? A human element makes no sense here at all. Also, why would they have just kidnapped him to leave him alive and so close to the house where he would have presumably more easily been found? It's like he was brought right to the edge of where the searchers were looking and left, unable to call for help. This sounds to me like the case of a fey creature or something similar, one who definitely does not like human beings, that was offended by something the child probably inadvertently did. The fey can usually shapeshift and transform themselves into anything they want to, and it seems like it might have turned into something that would appear as something desirable to the small boy, that he would be more willing to wander away to go and get it. Or there's nothing to say it didn't turn into one of the trusted adults in the boy's life. Then it punished him accordingly for whatever the perceived slight might have been. Jerry Lee is very lucky to have survived the ordeal, and while there's many avenues I thought about exploring in this case, the Fae just make the most sense to me. There's no way that the vine had been placed around his neck much longer than when the dog left him there to go and get help, meaning if the incident with the vine, which was strangling him and turning him blue, had occurred any time earlier than a mere few minutes before he was found that way, he would have strangled to death. That means that something had to have been there with him to do that, maybe as a warning to the parents or whoever would be finding him. What that warning would be, I have no clue. But if it had been a human being, there surely would have been some evidence left behind, right? I mean, human beings aren't perfect, but fairies seem to be, because they aren't beholden to our physical laws and our own laws of nature. A typical 3-year-old would know enough not to wrap a wild vine around his or her own neck, and so I wonder if maybe there had been some other fruit or maybe even some grapes in his own backyard that he tried to help himself to, thereby angering the Fae who think that all wild-grown fruits and berries belong to them. Either that, or it was a Fae child or youngling as they're called, and it thought the boy would be useful to it as a plaything, but the way Fae children play is a bit more violent and rough than most human children. There have even been cases that I think a human child would be abducted for the purpose of being a toy for a youngling, and I talk a lot about those specific cases in my book, Missing the Fae Theory. For now, though, it seems like Jerry Lee took whatever secrets he had from that day with him throughout his life, and if he's still alive, I don't know if he is, because there was almost no information on this case besides what I managed to scrounge up and I just read to you all. He'll take what he knows and what he experienced that day to the grave with him. And our final story from my newest book, Gone Mysterious Disappearances Volume 2, is Larry Dwayne Krebs. On March 30th, 1988, Larry Krebs and his 2-year-old son, also named Larry, but who is called Dwayne by his middle name, were on their 3rd day of a camping trip to Lake Texoma in southeastern Oklahoma. This is the oldest cold case in Bryan County, which is where the two were camping when the disappearance happened. Larry and his son were gathering firewood while walking along the bank of a river that fed into a nearby lake. They were 50 feet from the river, and Larry Sr. was walking no more than 8 steps ahead of his small son, who was right behind him the whole time. An article from September 11th of that year in the Daily Democrat newspaper said, quote, "He says that he walked ahead of his son, and when he turned around and looked, Dwayne was gone. He recalls never hearing a splash or any noise," end quote. Larry called in the authorities, but they found almost nothing in their extensive search for the toddler. The only thing they came across was a set of very small footprints that led into a puddle but never led back out. They presumed that these were little Dwayne's footprints, but it's unknown if they thought he had drowned in the puddle with his father only 8 steps in front of him, but obviously that scenario seems highly unlikely. Larry Dwayne Krebs' disappearance happened on the far northern end of Lake Texoma, right where the historic Fort Washita is located. This area is where the Confederate cemetery is located, and there's almost nothing but remote and desolate areas where a 2-year-old could very easily get lost. The area directly surrounding the river is full of wonderful vegetation, but it's so very thick and also a good place for a toddler to get lost or to just hide in if they wanted to. An extensive and massive search was launched for Dwayne, and a nearby river was dredged in search of his body, but nothing was ever found. 15 years after the incident occurred, Larry Krebs still couldn't come to terms with what had happened and how his son had disappeared so thoroughly while literally right under his nose like that, and in his desperation, he contacted a psychic, as they do. The psychic said that Dwayne had been abducted by someone who had put their hand over his mouth and nose and ran off with him. I've got some issues with this case, everyone. Let's talk about some of them now. If someone is going to abduct a child, they are going to do everything they can and go to great lengths to ensure that they aren't caught or found out. Just like anyone else who's trying to get away with committing a crime, or at least presumably so. There's no such thing as halfway crooks, right? So imagine the risk in this scenario. First of all, there would have had to have been someone out there already looking for a random kid to take on the off chance there would be one roaming around carefree and without being supervised by an adult. I say that because of the absolute remoteness of that particular area. This person would have had to have been lying in wait in the bushes and would have had to had super speed, at least in my opinion, and been able to silently sneak out of the bushes, grab the child soundlessly while also somehow making sure the child didn't make a sound, and also while being careful to avoid the father's peripheral vision as they ran off. Let's face it, we know when someone is standing behind us or moving around, and human beings aren't just known for being, we're not known for being that stealthy. But let's just say that this unknown person managed to do all of the above mentioned things perfectly and without leaving any trace of their presence behind once they did so. Then how did they get out of that area while holding a presumably terrified child with their hand over the child's mouth and possibly his nose too, while having to get past not only Dwayne's father, but also anyone else who would be on their way towards whatever vehicle the perpetrator was planning on taking him to? Why wouldn't a 2-year-old make any noise? If they claimed to know that the boy walked into a puddle, then why weren't there any signs of him being lifted out of it? If they claimed to know that the boy walked into a puddle, then why weren't there any signs of him being lifted out of it, like the father hearing the inevitable splashing that would have definitely come along with that? Remember, the father didn't know the child stepped into a puddle and was only told Dwayne had done so later on by authorities who believed they had tracked his son's footsteps into one. Maybe. A 2-year-old boy isn't going to gently and politely tiptoe into a giant puddle. He's going to jump in, probably splashing and laughing, and definitely drawing his dad and anyone else who's around's attention to what he was doing. Puddles are playthings for little kids. I'm not sure what really happened here, but I do believe Larry Krebs about his son being there 1 second and gone the next, taken right out from under his nose and leaving no trace behind, because it happens so often. Believe it or not, I come across this type of story all the time, and when looking at other cases just like this one, so-called wild men and even Bigfoot himself are the main culprits. Most of the evidence, or at least what's considered evidence in this community, points to. There have even been witnesses to so-called wild men running through the woods and past shocked onlookers with what look like children on their backs. I don't know how true those legends are or those stories are, but there's at least one pretty popular and well-known case where a couple saw this happen but didn't know exactly what they were seeing until the next day when they got home from their trip and realized the little boy had gone missing in the same area where they had just been vacationing and saw that very odd sight. I'm not sure what I think about wild men abducting kids, but I've done enough research on Bigfoot to know that the descriptions of these so-called feral humans and Bigfoot itself have a lot of the same details in common. It's enough to make you rethink a lot of what you think you know about what goes on in the woodlands of the world, and hopefully it all makes you think about how you can better protect yourself and your young children as well. Larry Dwayne Krebs has never been found, nor has any trace of him ever been found either. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content and if you enjoyed hanging out with me. If you want to support me, spread the love by sharing this video. Spread the love by sharing the book link. So what I read from today is Campfire Stories Volume 1, but there is also a Volume 2. Gone Mysterious Disappearances Volume 1 and Gone Mysterious Disappearances Volume 2, my brand new one that I'm trying to get to number 1. If you've bought any of my books in any format off Amazon, please go and give a 5-star rating and a great review. Guys, the books are like my main income right now. Just for now, but for now. You know what I'm saying? So please, if you can support me in that way, I would really appreciate it. The description box has important links as well, aside from the links to the books, ways to donate to the channel, PayPal, Cash App, becoming a patron, becoming a member, my Amazon wish list gift link if you want to send me, like, I don't know, crystals, decks, whatever the heck I have on there. Also, my email address, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. You can send me your own encounter stories, whether in the woods or otherwise, because I do listener encounters, and I am planning on doing a Campfire Stories Volume 3, maybe up to a 10 or 12 series, just like I'm doing with Gone. I'm already working on Volume 3. There's so much more I normally say, guys, but I'm kind of tired. I've been filming this for an hour and 40 minutes, so I'm interested to see how much I'm going to have to cut out, how many mistakes I made. We had thunder and lightning crackling. We had the power go out. We had like 3 or 4 ants crawling on my desk, and then they went onto my leg. There's a lot going on behind the scenes right now. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. This writing books and having my name on a book and my photo in a book and being a best-selling author has been a dream of mine since I was 5 years old. And a lot of you know my story and how impossible this dream seemed 7 years ago, 6 years ago even. So don't ever give up on yourself. I believe in you. I got your back. Always go in grace, smile at a stranger, and I'll see you guys next time.